To summarize British colonization of America, we have looked at two colonies, Virginia and Massachusetts Bay. Those are the most two important colonies. They are the first two, and also coming up to the American Revolution, they will be the most important two colonies throughout this whole period. It's not that the other ones aren't important, it's just these are the most important. And from these two, we get the fundamental American temperament that will help propel the United States to become the world economic superpower. Individualism. This is something that we get from the very beginning of the country. Now, it is a mistake to say, don't say the United States created individualism, because that's not true. England was the freest and richest country in the world at the time. It had the most advanced economy. And so it brought over the most individualistic people, and then what will become the United States made them even more individualistic. Individualism has downfalls. It's not perfect. Just like everything else, if it's taken too far to too big of an extreme, then it's a bad thing. We have gone through periods in U.S. history where we have become too individualistic, what's called toxic individualism. We are going through one right now, in fact. We had one in the 1920s also. But an individualistic society is beneficial. It is because of what it leads to. In terms of economics, it leads to capitalism. In terms of politics, it will lead to representative democracy, where everyone gets a vote. You get a vote for electors. And in terms of social systems, mainly religion, you get religious freedom. These three things are highly associated with stability and success for countries long term. These are not perfect, especially capitalism and representative democracy. Never say that they are perfect and flawless, because that is just not true. Also, capitalism, a lot of people say it means no government interference. That's not correct. To have a capitalist system, you have to have a stable government. But these three things are associated with a successful country long term. And we get these three things from the first two colonies. What happened in Virginia and Massachusetts Bay will be repeated over and over and over again. In Virginia, rich elites tried to oppress the population for their economic gains. And it failed. And it failed for one very good reason. The United States, or what will become the United States, is geographically massive. And so when British colonists were put in slave-like conditions, they ran away. They had an option, and that was to escape. Elites will try to do this in almost all of the colonies in America. It happened in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. It will happen over and over and over again. And every time it fails for the same reason, the colonists would just run away. So because the elites were not able to enslave the population or exploit the labor, they had to give them an incentive-based system. And that meant capitalism. Once capitalism was established and people started becoming wealthy, then they want a say in the government, which leads to representative democracy. Again, these two things are so fundamentally important to long-term stability. Neither of them are perfect. And don't ever let anyone tell you they are perfect. But they are so highly correlated with long-term success and stability. And there are tons of examples all throughout the world of how true this is. When I say examples, I mean places where you have two places that are geographically right next to each other. The populations should be similar, but they're divided by political and economic institutions. A good example is Mexico, and a lot of places in the United States. One of the most famous examples, Nogales. You don't have to memorize this, but Nogales, the Mexican side is incredible amounts of poverty and crime, violence, rape. The American side, in Arizona, the standard of living is significantly higher, and it is just a much safer and much more stable place. I'm not saying America is better, it's just Mexico has a long history of having a very corrupt political system. And a lot of it is run by drug cartels. But they're right next to each other. So the only thing that separates them is a wall. One half, you have representative democracy and capitalism. The other half, you have a little bit more of a free-for-all. The American side is so wealthy that they will help fight fires on the Mexican side. And again, this doesn't mean America is better. It just means it developed more stable political and economic institutions. The most famous example of this, though, is Korea. North and South Korea have the same history, the same population. The only difference is that after World War II, the North will be controlled by the Soviets, and it will be supposedly communist, but it's really a dictatorship led by one family, close to a monarchy. South is one of the richest countries in the world. That is a picture of Korea at night. South is industrialized, it's advanced, it has lights. The North is so impoverished. The United States still sends food just to keep the population from starving. So capitalism and representative democracy, they're both flawed. They both have problems, but they're the best political and economic institutions that we have yet to discover. In terms of the third, religious freedom, this is so important because unlike the other two, there is no downside to religious freedom. Religious freedom, theocracies, or countries that are ruled by a religion, they are oppressive and never associated with freedom or democracy. And this is true all throughout history, and is true to this day. Currently in the world, there are only 7 theocracies. Afghanistan, Iran, Mauritania, it's a country in West Africa, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Yemen, Vatican City. None of them are free societies. So I have heard people argue that theocracies are actually good, and no, you in theory maybe, I don't even think so in theory, but you cannot find an example of a theocracy that is a free society, and it cannot work out long term. Because no one religion has a monopoly on intelligence, skill, and talent. Those 3 things are absolutely fundamental to long-term stability of a nation. So that is why Virginia and Massachusetts Bay are so important, because we get those 3 things, and the same thing that happened in those two colonies will happen all throughout the other colonies in America. And that is why the United States has been able to grow and be so prosperous long term. Finally, last important thing to know from these 2 colonies, Virginia and Massachusetts Bay, is we get the regional differences that will dominate the United States up until the end of this semester. The North will create a balanced economy and will become much more like what the United States is going to be. They'll have business, manufacturing, commerce, trade. In the South, the economy will be based totally on what are called staple crops. And this is because the South had the right kind of soil. It is a certain kind of black soil that allows for the growing of staple crops. And so in the South, starting with Virginia, they will just focus on growing a massive amount of staple crops. It used to be cotton. It was tobacco during this period and will eventually become cotton. All the South will be totally devoted to grow staple crops. That's what the economy will be based on. So if you remember from the beginning, it is very bad to have an economy based on one natural resource, the resource curse or the perils of plenty. The South will be based totally on one crop, and that is a staple crop. It will be tobacco and then cotton. And the important thing about these is they must be picked by hand, which is why the South will develop plantation economies. These are huge swaths of land, hundreds, thousands of acres, controlled by one person. And in order to maintain a stable workforce, they will have to import hundreds of thousands of Africans. I know I said British colonists would just run away. That true will not be the same for Africans, and we'll get to this why later on in the semester. But the plantation economies would have lots of lands, and then they would bring in slave labor. The South's economic system will be totally devoted from Virginia to the Civil War and after on one staple crop, plantation economies, and slave labor system. So from the very first two colonies, we get the regional differences that will just grow and grow and become more exaggerated over time, leading to the very end of the semester, the Civil War. I hope everyone had a great Labor Day. Take care.